In the early 1990s, Times Square was America's warning label, the block where New York's global brand went to die. The city responded with a $2.6 billion gamble, treating public safety as a product to be engineered and sold. This was not grassroots renewal. It was a ruthless top-down campaign. Broken windows policing on one side, block-by-block property seizures on the other, all paving the way to a single seismic question. If you can make fear disappear overnight with money, who gets to decide what's left behind? On the ground, the city's new product, public safety, meant a relentless crackdown on the smallest signs of disorder. NYPD patrols swept Times Square for graffiti, busted squeegee men, and hauled in anyone caught drinking from a paper bag. The policy was called broken windows, and it did not just target major crimes. Officers were ordered to arrest for turnstile jumping, loitering, fare evasion, and even sitting on stoops. The message was clear. Visible chaos would not be tolerated, no matter how minor. A retired NYPD commander remembers those directives. Each shift began with a list: graffiti hotspots, subway stations plagued by fare beaters, corners where panhandlers gathered. The goal was to flood the streets with uniformed presence and rack up arrests for quality-of-life violations. In 1994 alone, thousands of people were booked for offenses that had barely registered a year earlier. Public urination, open containers, subway dancing, every infraction became a signal that the city was back in control. The theory behind it was simple. If a single broken window was left unrepaired, more would follow. Disorder bred fear, and fear kept business and families away. So the NYPD treated every small act of disorder as a threat to the city's future. Officers ticketed street vendors without permits. They shut down unlicensed cab drivers. Even street performers found themselves pushed out or arrested if they did not have the right paperwork. The emphasis was on eliminating disorder at street level. For some, the effect was immediate. Tourists and office workers noticed a cleaner, more orderly Times Square. The numbers backed it up. Felony crime in Midtown South dropped by more than 50% between 1993 and the mid-1990s. But the sweep was broad, catching not just criminals, but the poor, the homeless, and anyone who did not fit the new, marketable image of New York. The city's brand was being rebuilt one arrest at a time, block by block, as officers enforced order with a precision that felt, to many, like a campaign. Before any real estate deal could be made, the city had to prove it could manufacture safety, and that started with the street, not the skyline. Condemnation notices began arriving on 42nd Street in the late 1980s. Each envelope carried the weight of state authority, an order to vacate, a promise of compensation, and a warning. The city now owned the future of these blocks. Dive bars, peep shows, pawn shops, and decades-old diners were all swept into the same legal process. The Urban Development Corporation, armed with emergency powers granted by state law, declared the area blighted and moved to seize hundreds of properties between Broadway and 8th Avenue. For many owners and tenants, the offer was non-negotiable. Appraisers set values below what the open market might bring, citing years of code violations and declining rents. Some challenged the takings in court. Over 40 lawsuits were filed by 1989, but none succeeded in halting the wave. The public rationale was clear. This was not just about removing vice, but about creating a blank slate for large-scale investment. Once the state controlled the land, it did not act as a landlord. Instead, it turned to a new kind of steward. In 1990, the new 42nd Street nonprofit was established. Its board, a mix of state officials, Broadway executives, and civic leaders. The nonprofit's mandate was to manage and restore 6 historic theaters seized by eminent domain, ensuring they would never again house adult entertainment. Their charter called for the preservation of cultural assets and the return of legitimate theater to the block. Leases and subleases were structured to keep control in public hands while drawing in private expertise and investment. The process was methodical. The nonprofit orchestrated the restoration of theaters like the Apollo, Empire, and Liberty, working with developers and arts organizations to bring them back to life. Some buildings were demolished, others gutted and rebuilt. The city auctioned air rights to finance the condemnation, and developers received tax credits in return. Displaced businesses were offered cash buyouts or relocation support, but many rejected the terms as inadequate, especially those barred from reopening by new zoning laws targeting adult uses. By the mid-1990s, the transformation was nearly complete. The state and its nonprofit partner had cleared the canvas. Dozens of blocks, once a patchwork of independent owners and unpredictable tenants, now stood under unified control. The groundwork was set for the next phase, attracting a single high-profile tenant who could make the new Times Square credible to the world. Negotiations between New York officials and Disney team were conducted with precision. For Disney, the risk was obvious. The New Amsterdam Theater was a crumbling relic in the middle of a district known for crime and uncertainty. No amount of optimism could hide the fact that a private company would be betting its brand on ground zero of urban decay. The city's answer was to remove every possible obstacle and to absorb the risk itself. The deal began with money. Disney received $26 million in a low-interest loan underwritten by city and state development funds to finance the restoration of the New Amsterdam. The terms were generous. The loan would cover the cost of repairs that private banks were unwilling to touch, and Disney's repayment obligations were structured to ease the burden in the early years. On top of the loan, the company secured long-term property tax abatements that would stretch for decades, cutting millions from Disney's operating costs and making the economics of Broadway production suddenly viable. But the incentives did not stop at financing. Disney's negotiators insisted on a guarantee that the city would handle the eviction and relocation of any remaining adult businesses, not only in the theater itself, but on the surrounding block. The state and city agreed, using their powers to clear out the last holdouts and deliver a sanitized footprint. Disney's lawyers drafted clauses allowing the company to walk away if the city failed to deliver a clean environment. The deal was engineered so that Disney would never be left exposed, even if the neighborhood backslid. City finance officials justified the package as a necessary investment. The public subsidy was not charity. It was a calculated move to buy credibility and unlock billions in future development. The rationale was simple. If the city could guarantee Disney's safety and profitability, every other major corporation would follow. The risk was not just reversed, it was transferred from Disney's balance sheet to the city's books, all in the name of transforming Times Square into a global brand. Restoration of the New Amsterdam Theater began as an act of faith and spectacle. The building, once a jewel of Broadway, had fallen into ruin. Its marble columns were cracked, and the ceiling frescoes were blackened by decades of neglect. Disney's team brought in artisans from across the country, plaster workers, muralists, gilders, and carpenters, each tasked with reviving details that had not been seen since 1903. The project cost soared past $34 million, far beyond what the city's loan could cover. But the mandate was clear. Nothing less than full historical glory would do. For nearly 2 years, scaffolding wrapped the facade, while inside, workers uncovered hidden mosaics and restored gold leaf by hand. Original fixtures were recast, velvet seats were custom dyed, and the grand staircase was rebuilt from archival photos. The process became news itself, with progress updates and behind-the-scenes tours for the press. The restoration was designed not just to save a building, but to stage a public transformation, proof that Times Square was no longer off-limits. On November 13th, 1997, the curtains rose on The Lion King. The opening drew celebrities, politicians, and a heavy police presence. Reporters filled the lobby and television crews broadcast the spectacle nationwide. The the restored New Amsterdam glowed with fresh gilding and crystal light, a beacon on 42nd Street. For the first time in decades, families lined up outside after dark. The message was unmistakable. If Disney's Lion King could premiere here, Times Square was safe for anyone. The theater's rebirth was not just a cultural event, it was an economic signal, a live demonstration that the city's promise of safety and order was real. In that moment, the transformation moved from contract to public proof. The spectacle of opening night became the city's new calling card, opening the door for corporations and developers who had been waiting for a sign. Within months of Disney's public commitment, the investment flood began. Condé Nast signed on as the first major corporate tenant, announcing in 1996 that its new headquarters would anchor a 48-story tower at 4 Times Square. Nasdaq followed, unveiling its electronic stock market center and the now iconic LED billboard that wraps the corner of Broadway and 43rd. Morgan Stanley secured a 2 million square foot office complex, cementing the area's transformation from a red light district to a financial hub. Developers, retailers, and entertainment giants rushed to claim a stake. AMC and Lowe's opened multiplex theaters, drawing crowds that once would have avoided the neighborhood after dark. National restaurant chains and flagship retail stores arrived, filling glass storefronts that had stood empty for years. By the turn of the millennium, more than $2.6 billion in private capital had been poured into Times Square's redevelopment. 4 new office towers rose along 42nd Street and 7th Avenue, their construction financed by a mix of private investment and public incentives. The scale was unprecedented. In a span of less than a decade, Times Square became one of the most valuable commercial districts in the world. The area's economic output soared, with tourism, retail, and entertainment revenues setting new records year after year. The district's rebirth was visible in every direction. Neon marquees advertising Broadway shows, global brands stacked on every block, and sidewalks crowded with visitors from every continent. Corporate headquarters, stock tickers, and chain restaurants replaced the pawn shops and adult theaters. The city's bet had paid off in pure financial terms, setting a new template for urban redevelopment. But beneath the surface, questions lingered about what and who had been swept aside to make way for the boom. City budget analysts tracked the numbers as Times Square's new image took hold. The results were hard to ignore. Between 1993 and the mid-1990s, felony crime in Midtown South dropped by 51%. The area, once written off as a lost cause, became a case study in rapid turnaround. Police precincts reported record lows for robberies, assaults, and burglaries. The drop was not just on paper. Tourists started coming back in waves. By the late 1990s, Times Square was drawing more than 26 million visitors a year, a figure that would double over the next decade. Retailers and hotels reported year-over-year sales growth that outpaced the rest of Manhattan. City Hall pointed to a surge in hotel tax revenue and record Broadway ticket sales. The district's economic output soared, supporting nearly 10% of the city's jobs while occupying less than 0.1% of its land. Tourism became an engine. By the early 2000s, Times Square was pulling in over $4 billion in annual retail, entertainment, and hotel sales. Nearly 1/4 of every dollar spent by visitors to New York City was spent in this single district. The area's transformation was so complete that travel guides began ranking it among the top tourist destinations on Earth, rivaling Paris and London. For city officials, these figures were proof that the strategy had worked. Public safety, once a marketing slogan, now showed up as hard revenue on the city's balance sheet. The $2.6 billion in new investment brought not just skyscrapers and billboards, but a steady stream of tax dollars and jobs. In the eyes of budget analysts, Times Square was not just cleaned up, it was reborn as a financial powerhouse. Its success measured in falling crime rates and skyrocketing visitor counts. On the other side of the ledger, the cost of remaking Times Square was measured in lives uprooted and communities erased. Hundreds of small businesses, diners, pawn shops, independent theaters, and artist studios received condemnation notices as the state moved to clear the blocks for redevelopment. Owners like Maria Alvarez, who ran a 24-hour diner on 8th Avenue for nearly 30 years, watched as appraisers set values far below what the market might offer. The city's offer was final. There was no room for negotiation. Her family's restaurant closed in 1991, replaced by scaffolding and, eventually, a chain coffee shop. She never reopened. Artists who once found cheap studio space above the peep shows were forced out by eviction or rising rents. Some tried to fight back in court. Over 40 lawsuits challenged the takings, with support from civil rights lawyers and advocacy groups like the Coalition for Free Expression. The legal arguments ranged from claims of unfair compensation to constitutional challenges over free speech and public purpose. None succeeded. The courts upheld the city's right to seize property in the name of economic development, setting a precedent that left little recourse for those pushed aside. The sweep was not limited to business owners. Single-room occupancy tenants, many elderly or disabled, were relocated with modest payments and little support. Social workers documented dozens of cases where residents struggled to find new housing as rents across Manhattan soared. The promise of relocation often meant a bus ticket to the outer boroughs, far from jobs and social networks. Civil rights advocates traced a direct line from these evictions and policing tactics to the city's later stop and frisk era. The same quality of life logic that justified arresting squeegee men in Times Square would, a decade later, lead to millions of police stops, overwhelmingly targeting Black and Latino New Yorkers. Reports from the Legal Aid Society and the New York Civil Liberties Union documented how the crackdown on disorder became a pipeline to mass incarceration. For many, the new Times Square was safe not because danger had vanished, but because those deemed undesirable had been systematically removed. The stories of those displaced rarely made headlines. Most left quietly, their absence smoothed over by the city's new brand of order. But beneath the neon and the crowds, the question lingered. Whose city had been saved, and at what cost? Today, cities worldwide chase the Times Square formula, selling safety and spectacle for profit, often at the cost of authenticity. As urban rebrands multiply, the lesson is clear. A city's soul is not measured in tourist dollars alone. The next transformation, here or elsewhere, will test whether we can balance prosperity with belonging. Who gets to call a city home remains the question New York still struggles to answer.